Mom, what did you do? My son shouted through the phone at 6:30 on a gray Michigan morning. The mortgage payment bounced again. I sat quietly at my kitchen table, watching snow drift past the window above the sink while his voice cracked with panic on the other end of the line. For a moment, I didn't answer. I simply wrapped both hands around my chipped coffee mug and listened to the sound of my 41-year-old son breathing like a frightened child. That was the first time Daniel had sounded afraid of me. "Helen," he said again, sharper this time. "Did you hear me?" I glanced toward the old wall clock George had bought at a flea market in Traverse City nearly 30 years ago. The ticking suddenly sounded louder than Daniel's voice. "I heard you," I said calmly. Silence filled the line for 2 long seconds. Then came Rachel's voice in the background, tense and hurried. "Ask her if she froze it." My stomach tightened, not because of the accusation, but because she already knew the answer. Outside, the snow kept falling over our little neighborhood in Grand Rapids, covering the sidewalks and parked cars in soft white layers that made everything look peaceful from a distance. Funny how appearances work that way. "Mom," Daniel said carefully now, lowering his voice as though kindness might fix whatever was happening. "We need to know what's going on." Need. That word nearly made me smile. For 2 years, I had needed things too. I needed my prescription refilled last winter when my blood pressure medicine doubled in price. I needed new tires before driving through icy roads in January. I needed someone to explain why my pension checks always seemed smaller than they should have been. But every time I mentioned money, Rachel would tilt her head sympathetically and say, "Everything's expensive these days, Helen." And I believed her. God help me, I believed her. I looked down at the envelope sitting beside my coffee cup. The bank statement was still folded open to the page that had changed everything. Rows of transfers. Exact amounts. Exact dates. Month after month after month. My pension. Their mortgage. Daniel exhaled heavily into the phone. "Mom, if you stopped the payments without warning us. I interrupted softly. He stopped talking. I could hear Rachel whispering furiously behind him now, though I couldn't make out the words. Somewhere in the background, a cabinet door slammed shut. I closed my eyes for a moment and pictured George standing in this very kitchen years ago, still wearing his work boots after a 12-hour shift at the paper mill. One day, he once told me quietly while balancing the checkbook at this same table, "You're going to have to stop trusting people just because you love them." Back then, I laughed at him. I told him family would never take advantage of family. I was wrong. "Mom," Daniel said again, sounding smaller now, "please talk to me." I opened my eyes slowly and stared out at the frozen Michigan morning. "I spent 2 years wondering why I couldn't afford groceries," I said. "Now I finally know where the money went." Daniel did not answer me right away. I could hear the sound of Rachel speaking somewhere farther from the phone now, her voice low and strained, like someone trying to keep a problem from spilling into the street where the neighbors could see it. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat. "Mom, maybe we should come over and talk about this in person." I stared at the frost gathering along the edges of my kitchen window. The old heater rattled weakly beside the refrigerator, struggling against another Michigan winter. "No," I said quietly. "I do not think I want company today." Before he could answer, I hung up the phone and placed it carefully beside the sugar bowl George and I bought during our honeymoon trip to Mackinac Island in 1978. For a long time, I simply sat there listening to the house settle around me. The pipes creaked softly inside the walls. Snow brushed against the windows. Somewhere down the street, a snowplow groaned through the neighborhood. Everything felt painfully normal. That was the cruel part. Betrayal never arrives looking dramatic. It slips quietly into ordinary life until one day you realize your entire reality has been rearranged without your permission. I stood slowly and walked toward the hallway closet where I kept my winter coat. The left sleeve still carried a faint smell of lavender from the sachets I tucked into the pockets every December. George used to tease me about that. "You are trying to make Michigan smell like a flower garden," he would laugh. I closed my eyes for a moment at the memory of his voice. 3 years gone, and there were still mornings when I expected to hear his boots crossing the kitchen floor before dawn. After he died, the silence inside this house became something physical, heavy, permanent. At first, Daniel visited almost every weekend. Rachel came too, carrying casseroles and grocery bags, insisting they wanted to help me adjust. She hugged me often back then, asked if I was sleeping, asked if I needed anything from the pharmacy. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have family nearby. Looking back now, I wonder if that was around the time they first gained access to my accounts. The signs had been there long before I allowed myself to see them. Bills disappearing from the mail pile. Rachel offering to organize my paperwork because she said online banking confused older people. Daniel casually asking questions about the pension George left me. At the time, none of it felt threatening. It felt practical, loving even. I reached for my coat and slipped it on slowly before heading outside. The cold hit my face immediately, sharp enough to sting my eyes. My driveway needed shoveling again, but my shoulders had not been the same since last winter. George always handled the snow. Even during his final years, when arthritis twisted his hands, he still insisted on clearing the driveway before I woke up. "You spent your whole life taking care of everyone else," he used to say. "Let me take care of this." I swallowed hard and made my way carefully down the icy sidewalk toward the mailbox. Inside were 2 grocery coupons, a heating bill, and a holiday catalog addressed to Rachel. She still used my address for some deliveries. That realization suddenly felt different now. Intentional. I carried the mail back inside and set it on the counter beside the bank statement. The transfer amounts stared back at me in neat black numbers. $1,400. Every month. Always on the 3rd. Always routed into the same mortgage account. Nearly 2 years of payments. Nearly $34,000 gone while I sat in this freezing little kitchen clipping coupons for canned soup and generic cereal. My chest tightened as another memory surfaced. Last February, I told Rachel I might need to sell George's old fishing boat because money felt tight after my property taxes increased. She had touched my arm gently and said, "That might be wise, Helen. You have to think practically at your age." At your age? I remember nodding back then, embarrassed that I could not seem to manage my finances the way George once had. But now I understood why Rachel looked relieved when I sold that boat. Every sacrifice I made had protected them, not me. I lowered myself carefully into my chair again and stared at the snow outside. Somewhere across town, my son was probably pacing his expensive kitchen floor beside the woman he chose over his own mother's dignity. And for the first time in years, I stopped wondering whether I had done something wrong. That afternoon, the snow finally stopped falling, leaving the whole neighborhood buried under a layer of white, so bright it almost hurt my eyes to look at it. I stood at the kitchen sink washing the same coffee cup twice because my mind would not settle long enough to notice what my hands were doing. Every few minutes, I caught myself staring toward the driveway, half expecting Daniel's black SUV to pull up outside. He always drove too fast through snowstorms. George used to complain about it constantly. "That boy thinks four-wheel drive makes him immortal," he would mutter from the living room window. I dried the cup carefully and placed it back in the cabinet beside 3 others I rarely used anymore. Most of the dishes in this house sat untouched now. When George was alive, the kitchen stayed busy from morning until bedtime. Pancakes on Saturdays. Chili simmering during Lions games. Thanksgiving dinners loud enough to shake the windows. After he passed, the room seemed to shrink around the silence. Around 2 o'clock, my phone buzzed again across the counter. Rachel this time. I watched her name flash on the screen until it stopped ringing. A minute later, another call came. Then another. Finally, a voicemail notification appeared. I did not listen to it. Instead, I opened the refrigerator and stared at the nearly empty shelves. Half a carton of eggs. Butter. A container of chicken soup I had stretched across 3 dinners already. Last month, I skipped buying fresh fruit because the heating bill came in higher than expected after a cold front moved across Michigan. I remember standing in the grocery aisle holding a small bag of grapes before quietly putting it back. At the time, I blamed inflation. Now I understood I had been paying part of my son's mortgage while deciding whether apples were too expensive. The humiliation of that realization settled deeper than anger. Around 3 o'clock, I pulled George's old filing box from the hall closet and carried it into the dining room. Dust coated the metal handles. Inside were years of paperwork organized in his careful handwriting. Tax returns, insurance forms, pension records. George believed every important paper deserved its own folder. "One day, you will thank me for this system," he used to joke whenever I teased him about labeling everything. My fingers trembled slightly as I sorted through the files. Near the bottom of the box, I found a thin blue folder marked Helen Personal in thick black marker. Inside were copies of our pension documents along with a handwritten note folded neatly between two statements. I recognized George's handwriting immediately. Even after all these years, seeing it still made my chest ache. Helen, if anything ever feels wrong financially, promise me you will ask questions first and trust people second. I sat very still at the table after reading that sentence. The dining room clock ticked softly above me, while late afternoon light stretched across the hardwood floors George refinished by hand nearly 20 years ago. He knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to worry. Enough to leave warnings behind. Suddenly, another memory surfaced. 6 months after George's funeral, Daniel insisted I add Rachel to my online banking account, just for convenience. I remember hesitating because computers always made me nervous. Rachel smiled patiently and said, "This way we can help if you ever forget passwords or need assistance paying bills." She sounded kind, concerned. I even thanked her afterward. My stomach twisted as I realized how easily trust can disguise itself as love. The front door rattled slightly as cold wind pushed against it outside. Evening was settling over the neighborhood now, turning the snowbanks pale blue beneath the streetlights. I rose slowly from the table and carried the blue folder back to the kitchen. Then I opened the junk drawer beside the stove and removed the small spiral notebook where I tracked monthly expenses by hand. I flipped through page after page filled with tiny, careful numbers. Heating costs, prescription refills, grocery totals. Every sacrifice I made was written there in black ink. The canceled dentist appointment last spring because I could not justify $800 for a crown. The winter coat I repaired twice instead of replacing. The fishing boat I sold because Rachel convinced me retirement meant downsizing. All while nearly $1,400 disappeared from my pension every month into their beautiful suburban house with heated floors and granite countertops. I closed the notebook slowly. Then I reached for the phone beside the refrigerator and dialed the number printed at the bottom of the bank statement. This time, I was not calling to ask questions. The woman who answered at the bank introduced herself as Melissa and sounded no older than 30. Her voice carried the bright, practiced politeness of someone who had never spent a winter worrying about heating bills. I almost hung up when she asked for verification information. My hands had started trembling again, and suddenly I felt foolish for calling at all. But then I looked down at George's handwriting resting beside the phone, and something inside me steadied. "I need to remove all authorized users from my accounts immediately," I said carefully. There was a short pause on the line. Keys clicked softly in the background. "I can help you with that, Mrs. Whitmore," Melissa replied. "However, I do need to ask if there is a specific concern regarding account access." Concern. Such a small word for what I was beginning to understand. I walked slowly toward the living room window while she reviewed my files. Outside, the snowbanks glowed beneath the porch lights of neighboring houses. Across the street, old Mr. Jensen struggled to pull his trash bins toward the curb while bundled in a thick red coat. Life kept moving so casually around me that it almost felt insulting. "Mrs. Whitmore?" Melissa's tone changed slightly when she returned to the line. More cautious now. "I see that your daughter-in-law, Rachel Whitmore, has had secondary authorization on your pension account for approximately 22 months. 22 months. Nearly 2 years. I lowered myself carefully onto the armchair beside the window because my knees suddenly felt weak. Was she allowed to move funds? I asked quietly. More silence. "Yes, ma'am. According to the records, there were recurring transfer permissions established electronically from your account to another account ending in 4391. I already knew which account that was. Still, hearing another person confirm it made something cold spread through my chest. "And who approved those transfers?" I asked. "The authorization appears to have been completed using your online profile credentials." I closed my eyes slowly. Rachel had set up my online banking herself. Daniel sat beside her that afternoon at my kitchen table while she explained how much easier digital accounts would make retirement. I remember feeling embarrassed because I could never keep passwords straight. Rachel smiled kindly and wrote everything down for me on a yellow sticky note. Later that evening, she insisted on helping me create security questions. What is your favorite vacation spot? What was your first pet's name? Little things family members naturally knew already. God, they had planned this carefully. "Mrs. Whitmore," Melissa said gently, "would you like me to suspend all future transfers immediately?" I opened my eyes and stared at George's recliner sitting empty near the fireplace. The fabric on the armrests was worn smooth from years of his hands resting there every evening after work. I suddenly remembered one particular night during the final winter before he got sick. We had been sitting together watching snow fall outside this same window when Daniel called asking for help with a down payment on the house Rachel wanted. George listened quietly after I hung up the phone. Then he sighed and said, "Helping people once is kindness. Teaching them to depend on your sacrifice forever is something else." Back then, I accused him of being too hard on our son. I defended Daniel immediately. "He just needs time," I told him. "Young families struggle." George never argued after that. He simply nodded and looked back out the window. Sitting there now, I realized he had already seen the future I refused to imagine. "Yes," I told Melissa finally. "Freeze everything." More keys clicking softly. "Done," she said. "No additional transfers will process from this point forward." The room felt strangely quiet after those words. Not triumphant, not relieved, just quiet. As though a long, invisible leak inside my life had finally stopped dripping. Melissa cleared her throat carefully. "Mrs. Whitmore, there is one more thing you should probably know." My fingers tightened around the phone. "What is it?" "Over the past year, there were also 3 withdrawal requests submitted from your retirement emergency reserve account." My heart began beating harder. "How much?" "A little over $12,000 total." I stared blankly toward the dark kitchen. $12,000. Enough to repair my roof last spring when rainwater leaked through the attic insulation. Enough to cover every prescription I delayed filling. Enough to replace the old furnace George kept repairing before he died. My voice sounded distant even to me when I finally asked the question. "Who withdrew it?" Melissa hesitated only briefly this time. "Your son, Daniel Whitmore, was listed as the requesting party on all 3 authorizations." After I ended the call with the bank, I remained in George's recliner long after the house had gone dark around me. The only light came from the small lamp beside the sofa and the pale reflection of snow outside. The windows. $12,000. I kept repeating the number silently in my head as though saying it enough times might eventually make it feel less real. But it only became heavier. More personal. Daniel knew. That was the part that hollowed me out from the inside. Rachel manipulating things almost made sense in a painful way. I had seen glimpses of ambition in her from the beginning. The expensive handbags before they could afford them. The way she spoke about neighborhoods as though zip codes determined human worth. But Daniel was my son. I carried him for 9 months. I worked double shifts at the diner when he was little so he could attend summer baseball camps. George spent years putting extra money into savings because Daniel dreamed of attending Michigan State without student loans. We built our lives around giving him stability. And somewhere along the way, he learned to look at his own mother and see a funding source instead of a person. I rose slowly and walked toward the hallway where family photographs lined the walls. Most of them were older now. Faded edges. Glass frames scratched by time. There was Daniel at 8 years old holding his first fish beside Lake Michigan, grinning with 2 missing front teeth while George crouched proudly beside him. Another photo showed Daniel at his college graduation wearing a green cap and gown while I cried so hard my mascara streaked down my face. Back then, I thought sacrifice guaranteed love. I touched the edge of one frame lightly before continuing down the hallway toward my bedroom. The electric blanket was already warming the mattress because I turned it on every evening now to save money on heating. Last year, Rachel suggested it after I mentioned my furnace bills were getting harder to manage. "Older people get cold easily anyway," she said with a little laugh while sipping wine in my kitchen. I remember laughing too. God, I laughed with them while they drained my retirement behind my back. I sat carefully on the edge of the bed and opened the small cedar chest beside my dresser. Inside were all the things I could never throw away after George died. His watch, old birthday cards, restaurant receipts. From anniversaries neither of us remembered anymore. At the bottom rested a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in George's careful block letters. For Helen only. I had seen it before but never opened it. At the funeral home, Daniel told me maybe I should wait until I felt emotionally stronger. Strange how many decisions other people made for me after I became a widow. My fingers hesitated briefly before opening the envelope now. Inside was a short handwritten letter dated 4 months before George passed away. "Helen, if you are reading this, then I was right to worry. I know you love Daniel enough to excuse almost anything, But love should never require blindness. Promise me something. Do not confuse guilt with kindness. Our retirement was built for your safety, not for anyone else's convenience. If people start treating your generosity like an obligation, stop giving, even if it hurts. Especially if it hurts. I lowered the paper slowly into my lap. Tears finally came then, quiet and exhausted. Not dramatic, just the kind that slip out when grief and humiliation become too tangled to separate anymore. I cried for George, for the years we spent planning a peaceful retirement together, for the version of Daniel I kept protecting inside my memory long after reality stopped matching it. But somewhere beneath the sadness, something else had begun forming too. Something colder, clearer. I wiped my face carefully and stood up again. Then I walked toward the small desk near the bedroom window where I kept household documents and stationery. One by one, I began organizing everything into separate piles. Pension records, property deeds, insurance accounts, legal contacts. The process felt strangely calming, like stitching together pieces of myself I had allowed other people to scatter. Around midnight, my phone buzzed again on the nightstand. Daniel. This time, there was also a text message underneath the missed call notification. Mom, please call me back. Rachel is upset, and we need to explain. Explain. I stared at that word for a long moment before setting the phone face down without answering. Because suddenly, after 2 years of silence, they seemed very eager to talk. The next morning, Michigan woke beneath another layer of snow thick enough to bury the tire tracks from yesterday. I stood in my kitchen before sunrise, watching the coffee pot slowly fill while the house creaked softly around me. For the first time in years, I did not feel confused about what needed to happen next. Hurt, yes. Exhausted, absolutely. But confusion had finally burned away during the night, leaving something colder and steadier behind. My phone remained face down on the counter where I left it before bed. Sometime after midnight, Daniel sent 3 more messages. Rachel sent 2. By morning, there was also a voicemail from my granddaughter Emma asking if I was all right, because her father seemed upset about bank stuff. That message hurt more than the others somehow. Children always notice tension long before adults admit it exists. I poured coffee into George's favorite mug, even though he had been gone 3 years now. Blue ceramic. Small crack near the handle. I still could not bring myself to throw it away. Steam curled upward while snow drifted quietly across the backyard outside the window. George loved mornings like this. He used to stand on the porch wrapped in his old flannel jacket, saying fresh snow made the whole world look honest again. Funny thing about honesty. Most people only value it when they are not hiding something. Around 8 o'clock, I called the attorney George and I used years ago when we prepared our estate documents. Harold Bennett answered on the 3rd ring with the same deep measured voice I remembered from nearly a decade earlier. Helen Whitmore, he said warmly after I introduced myself. It has been too long. How have you been holding up? The kindness in that question nearly cracked something open inside me again. But I steadied myself and said, I need to make changes to my accounts and my will immediately. Silence followed. Not surprised silence. Professional silence. I understand, Harold replied gently. Would you like to come into the office this afternoon? By noon, the roads were partially cleared, though dirty snow still lined the intersections in gray frozen piles. I drove slowly, downtown gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual, because my hands had not stopped trembling completely since yesterday. The attorney's office sat inside an old brick building overlooking the river. George always liked that place because the receptionist kept a jar of peppermints on her desk. Walking through those familiar doors without him beside me felt strangely unreal. Harold looked older now, thinner around the face. But his eyes softened immediately when he saw me step into his office carrying the blue folder from George's filing cabinet. Tell me what happened, he said quietly after closing the door behind us. So I did. Not dramatically, not emotionally. I simply laid the papers across his desk one at a time while explaining the transfers, the pension withdrawals, the mortgage account. Harold listened without interrupting, though his expression grew darker with every page he reviewed. Finally, he removed his glasses slowly and leaned back in his chair. Did you authorize any of this knowingly? He asked. No. The word came out firmer than I expected. And your son had access to these accounts? I nodded once. Harold folded his hands carefully. Helen, I need to ask you something difficult. I looked at him quietly. Do you believe your son understood where this money was coming from? For a moment, I could not answer. Because even now, some stubborn wounded part of me wanted to protect Daniel from the full weight of what he had done. Mothers are foolish that way. We search for excuses long after the truth becomes obvious. But then I remembered the winter coat I wore 2 seasons too long because money felt tight. I remembered skipping dental work while Rachel remodeled a kitchen larger than my entire first apartment with George. I remembered Daniel standing in my living room last Thanksgiving casually discussing interest rates while $12,000 from my emergency fund quietly disappeared behind my back. Yes, I whispered finally. I think he knew. Harold exhaled slowly through his nose. Then he pulled a yellow legal pad closer and began writing notes in careful, neat lines. All right, he said calmly. First, we remove every remaining authorization connected to your finances. Second, we update your estate immediately. And third, Helen, he paused briefly before meeting my eyes again. You stop feeling guilty for protecting yourself. The drive home felt different somehow. Colder outside, maybe. Or perhaps clearer. The afternoon sun reflected harshly against the snowbanks as I turned onto my street. Halfway up the driveway, I noticed tire tracks already pressed into the fresh snow near the garage. Daniel's SUV. My stomach tightened instantly. And when I stepped onto the porch, I saw him standing behind the frosted glass of my front door waiting for me inside my house. For a moment, I remained frozen on the porch with snow collecting along the shoulders of my coat while staring at the shape of my son through the glass. Daniel had his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his expensive wool jacket, pacing slowly across my living room rug the way he used to pace before high school exams. Strange how nervousness never really changes. Only the reasons behind it do. I unlocked the front door carefully and stepped inside without speaking. Warm air wrapped around me immediately, carrying the familiar scent of old books, coffee, and the cedar logs stacked near the fireplace. Daniel turned the moment he heard the door shut behind me. He looked exhausted. His normally neat hair was disheveled, and there were dark circles beneath his eyes I had never noticed before. Mom, he said quickly, stepping toward me. Thank God. You would not answer your phone. I removed my gloves slowly and hung my coat beside the door before looking at him directly. I was busy. He swallowed hard. Rachel is freaking out right now. The words settled heavily between us. Not I am sorry. Not are you okay. Rachel is freaking out. I walked past him into the kitchen and placed my purse beside the sink. Through the window above the counter, I could see snow sliding from the roof of the garage in soft white sheets. Everything outside remained painfully calm compared to the storm sitting inside my chest. Daniel followed me into the kitchen but kept his distance now, like a man uncertain whether approaching closer might make things worse. Mom, we need to talk about this misunderstanding. I let out a small tired breath at that word. Misunderstanding. As though nearly 2 years of hidden transfers had simply been an accounting error nobody noticed. I opened the refrigerator and removed the leftover soup from yesterday. Do you want some lunch? I asked quietly. Daniel blinked at me in confusion. What? Soup? I repeated. There is enough for both of us. He stared at me for a moment before shaking his head impatiently. Mom, please stop acting like this is normal. I paused with the container still in my hands. Then I turned slowly toward him. You are right, I said softly. None of this is normal. Silence stretched across the kitchen. The old clock above the stove ticked steadily while Daniel looked away first. He used to do that as a little boy whenever he lied about unfinished homework. We were going to tell you eventually, he muttered finally. The sentence hit harder than shouting would have, because hidden inside those words was confirmation. Not denial, not confusion, just timing. They were not sorry for taking the money. They were sorry I discovered it before they were ready. I placed the soup back into the refrigerator carefully. My hands felt strangely steady now. How long? I asked. Daniel rubbed both palms over his face before answering. The mortgage got harder after rates went up. Rachel lost clients at work. We thought it would only be temporary. Temporary. 22 months. And the $12,000 from my emergency account. He flinched visibly at that. The roof needed repairs last spring, he said quietly. We were already behind. I stared at him across the kitchen table George built with his own hands nearly 30 years ago. I remembered Daniel sitting at this very table coloring dinosaurs while I packed his school lunches before early shifts at the diner. I remembered helping him practice multiplication flashcards under this same light fixture. Every version of him existed in this room at once now. The little boy, the tired man, the stranger. Did you ever think about asking me? I said. Daniel finally looked directly at me then, and for the first time since he arrived, genuine shame crossed his face. We knew you would say no. The honesty of that answer hollowed something inside me completely. Because he was right. I would have said no. Not because I did not love him, but because retirement money was supposed to protect the years George and I had left after decades of working ourselves exhausted. They knew that, and they took it anyway. Daniel pulled out a chair slowly and sat down across from me. Suddenly, he looked older than 41. Smaller somehow. Rachel said you barely used most of the pension, he admitted quietly. She said it was just sitting there while we were struggling. I lowered myself into the chair opposite him and folded my hands together calmly. Daniel, I said, last winter I skipped refilling my blood pressure medication for almost 3 weeks because I thought I could not afford it. The color drained from his face instantly. He opened his mouth once, then closed it again without speaking. Outside, another gust of wind swept snow across the backyard. Inside my kitchen, my son finally looked like a man beginning to understand what he had done. Daniel sat motionless across from me after I mentioned the medication. His eyes drifted slowly toward the kitchen window, as though he suddenly could not bear to look directly at me anymore. Outside, the late afternoon sky over Michigan had turned pale gray again, the kind of heavy winter sky that promised another storm before morning. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The silence no longer felt awkward. It felt honest. Finally, Daniel leaned forward and rested both elbows against the kitchen table. Mom, he said quietly, I did not know things were that bad. I almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, but because of how carefully people avoid seeing suffering when seeing it would require them to change their behavior. You knew enough, I replied softly. He rubbed one hand over his forehead again. Rachel handled most of the finances. I should have paid more attention. There it was. The first small attempt to shift blame sideways. Not fully, just enough to soften his own reflection in the story. I looked down at my hands. Folded neatly on the table. The skin looked thinner these days. More veins visible beneath the surface. Aging sneaks up quietly like snowfall at night. One winter you suddenly realize your hands resemble your mother's hands, and your son has become a stranger sitting across from you in your kitchen. Your father warned me this might happen one day, I said calmly. Daniel's head lifted immediately. Dad, I nodded once. He worried you and Rachel were living beyond your means. Shame flickered across Daniel's face again. Things just got harder after the pandemic, he muttered. The mortgage, Emma's school tuition, the car payments. I listened quietly while he listed expenses one after another. Heated floors, private soccer leagues, vacation debt, streaming subscriptions, new appliances. Every problem sounded expensive, but none of them sounded necessary. Meanwhile, I had spent nearly 2 years stretching soup across multiple dinners and sewing loose buttons back onto old winter coats because I thought retirement simply demanded sacrifice. Daniel looked exhausted by the end of his own explanation. We were trying to stay afloat, he whispered. I studied him carefully for a long moment before answering. No, I said softly. You were trying to maintain a lifestyle. The words landed hard. I saw it immediately in the way his shoulders stiffened. Outside, wind rattled softly against the siding of the house. Somewhere upstairs, an old floorboard creaked as the heat kicked on again. This house had witnessed almost every important moment of my life. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, George teaching Daniel how to tie a necktie before prom. And now this. Rachel is scared, Daniel admitted quietly after another long silence. The bank called this morning about the missed mortgage payment. I looked at him steadily. I know. If we fall behind again. He stopped speaking halfway through the sentence. He did not need to finish it. For the first time since this conversation began, I finally understood why they were panicking so badly. It was never really about me discovering the truth. It was about losing access to the money. The realization settled over me with strange calmness. All this time, I kept searching for signs of guilt while missing the much simpler truth underneath. Dependence can look very similar to love when money is involved. Daniel glanced toward the hallway suddenly when headlights swept across the front windows outside. A car door slammed moments later. Then hurried footsteps crunched through snow toward the porch. Daniel's face tightened immediately. Rachel came, he said under his breath. Before I could answer, the front door opened sharply and Rachel stepped inside still wearing her long cream-colored coat dusted with snowflakes. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, but her eyes locked instantly onto Daniel. "Why are you not answering your phone?" she demanded before finally noticing me sitting at the kitchen table. The room fell quiet. Rachel looked different now that I understood who she truly was. Not cruel in an obvious way. That would have been easier. She still looked polished and composed, her blonde hair neatly pinned back, her diamond earrings catching the kitchen light exactly the way they always had during family dinners. But beneath the polished surface, I could finally see the calculation George noticed years ago. Rachel removed her gloves slowly and walked farther into the kitchen. "Helen," she said carefully, her voice softening into that familiar practiced sweetness I used to mistake for kindness. "We really need to clear up some misunderstandings." I stared at her calmly across the kitchen table where my husband once balanced checkbooks and birthday candles and homework assignments for the son sitting silently beside her now. Then I folded my hands together and said the one thing neither of them expected to hear. "I already met with my attorney this afternoon." Rachel stopped moving the moment those words left my mouth. For the first time since she entered the kitchen, her polished expression cracked slightly around the edges. Not dramatically, just enough for me to finally see the fear underneath. Daniel looked down at the table immediately, avoiding both our eyes like a child waiting for punishment. Outside, snow continued falling softly across the backyard, covering the footprints Rachel left on the walkway only minutes earlier. "An attorney," she repeated carefully, slipping off her gloves one finger at a time. "Helen, surely we do not need to involve lawyers in a family misunderstanding." Family misunderstanding. Strange how theft becomes softer once people fear consequences. I remained seated at the kitchen table while Rachel slowly lowered herself into the chair beside Daniel. For years, I would have rushed to calm tension like this. I would have apologized for making things uncomfortable. Women my age were raised that way. Keep peace. Swallow hurt. Protect family at any cost. But sitting there beneath the warm yellow kitchen light, I finally understood something George tried to teach me long ago. Peace built on silence is not peace at all. It is surrender. "You used my pension to pay your mortgage," I said quietly. "You emptied my emergency account without asking. That is not confusion, Rachel." She inhaled sharply through her nose before speaking again. "We intended to pay it back." I looked directly at her for several long seconds. "With what money?" Silence. Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside her. Rachel's jaw tightened slightly. There it was again. That same cold calculation hiding beneath politeness. She was not upset because she hurt me. She was upset because the arrangement ended. "We were under pressure," she said finally. "You have no idea how expensive things became after the economy changed." I almost smiled at that. "Actually," I replied softly, "I know exactly how expensive things became. I lived through it while financing your kitchen renovation." Daniel closed his eyes briefly at those words. Rachel looked toward him immediately, frustration flashing across her face before disappearing again. "Daniel," she said sharply, "say something." But my son remained silent. I realized then that this was probably the first time in years Rachel could not talk her way smoothly through a difficult situation. Because facts are stubborn things once they are written in bank statements instead of hidden behind family dinners and polite smiles. I stood slowly from the table and walked toward the counter where the blue folder still rested beside the coffee maker. Then I removed several papers and placed them carefully in front of them both. Updated account authorizations, legal notices, estate revisions. Rachel's eyes moved rapidly across the pages while color slowly drained from her face. "You removed Daniel as beneficiary?" she whispered. "Yes." The kitchen fell silent again except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of wind outside. Daniel finally looked up at me then, his expression wounded in a way I recognized instantly. He still saw himself as the injured one somehow. "Mom," he said quietly, "you are cutting us out over money?" I stared at my son across the kitchen table where I once helped him build school science projects and frost birthday cakes with clumsy little hands beside mine. "No," I answered calmly. "I am protecting myself because you taught me I need to." The truth of that settled heavily across the room. Rachel lowered the papers slowly onto the table while her wedding ring clicked softly against the wood. "So what happens now?" she asked. Such a simple question. But hidden beneath it was the real fear finally surfacing. Not guilt. Survival. I glanced toward the snow outside before answering. Now, I said quietly, you learn how expensive your life actually is. Daniel looked devastated by that sentence. Rachel looked angry, but neither of them denied what they had done anymore. And somehow, that mattered. I walked toward the living room window and looked out at the streetlights glowing against fresh snow. The whole neighborhood looked softer at night, cleaner, peaceful from a distance. Behind me, I heard Rachel gathering her purse while Daniel rose slowly from his chair. Neither argued further. Neither apologized. Some wounds are too deep for easy words anyway. At the front door, Daniel paused before leaving. Dad would hate this, he whispered without turning around. I felt the ache of George's absence settle briefly against my chest again. Then I looked at the snow-covered porch where my son stood waiting for an answer he probably already knew. No, I said softly. Your father hated it long before I did. After they left, I locked the front door carefully and turned off the kitchen light. The house fell quiet again around me, but this time the silence felt different. Not empty, not lonely, honest. And for the first time in years, I finally understood the difference between being needed and being valued.